All right, we can go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Alexandra Perez. I'm a Federal Affairs Manager here at the R Street Institute, and thank you all for tuning in today. I'm excited to be joined by a wonderful panel of experts to talk about opportunities for U.S. agriculture to grow the economy and cut emissions. I'll go ahead and introduce the panelists. So first we have Andrew Lentz. Andrew is Director of Federal Affairs for Agriculture Policy at the Environmental Defense Fund, where he focuses on policy implementation in the U.S. legislative and executive branches. Through coalition building and direct advocacy, he builds understanding of the key issues impacting agriculture and the environment, and seeks to reach bipartisan consensus on solutions to the most pressing challenges facing our food supply and our climate. Andrew is passionate about making progress on global climate goals while remaining inclusive of rural and underserved communities who acutely feel detrimental impacts of climate change. Next, we have Julie McClure, a Vice President at Tory Advisory Group, where she provides guidance and counsel to a wide range of clients across the food and agriculture value chain. Julie brings her unique expertise as a PhD biochemist with more than a decade of professional advocacy and experience to develop federal advocacy strategy, focusing on research, innovation, and sustainability. Prior to joining Team Tory, Julie spent 9 years with the Agronomy, Crop, and Soil Science Society, advocating for food, agriculture, and natural resource research programs across federal agencies through the annual appropriations process in the Farm Bill. And last but not least, we have Philip Rossetti. Phil is a resident senior fellow here at the R Street Institute for Energy and Environment Department. Before joining R Street, Philip was a fellow working with the minority staff of the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, where he supported congressional staff through policy and data analysis to brief legislators and supported the congressional mandate of producing policy recommendations for congressional climate action. Prior to that, he was the Director of Energy Policy at the American Action Forum, a center-right economically focused think tank. So again, thank you to our panelists for participating today. So climate change has become increasingly relevant to agricultural policy, and with Farm Bill season around the corner, the topic is obviously getting hotter. But many questions remain. So, some of them being what policies abate the most emissions, what policies would help or hurt U.S. agriculture competitiveness globally, are there opportunities for economic growth, and what pitfalls should policymakers avoid? And before we get a chance to dive into the weeds on some of these questions, I'd like to give each of the panelists a chance to provide some introductory remarks. So perhaps we can start with maybe the order that I went in. So Andrew, then Julie, and then Philip.
Yeah, thanks, Alex, and really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you all today. My name is Andrew Lentz. I am the Director of Federal Affairs for Agriculture Policy at the Environmental Defense Fund. We are a scientific, economic, and advocacy organization dedicated to finding climate solutions, working with any and all stakeholders to quickly draw down emissions from all sectors. I focus on agriculture policy, obviously, and so my job is really to work with those in policymakers in Congress and within the administration to implement new policy and provide policy support for farmers and ranchers to adopt climate smart agriculture practices so that we can help in this deployment of these new innovative practices and technologies in the sector, and to really open up new opportunities for farmers as it becomes harder and harder to farm in a changing climate. Agriculture accounts for about 11% of overall emissions in the United States, primarily from methane and nitrous oxide, with a little bit of carbon as well. And so finding ways that we can have public policy and corporate policy really support farmers in their endeavors to reduce emissions and improve the stewardship of their land. And so that's really what I focus on. And yeah, this is going to be a big year for us. Obviously, with the Farm Bill is a huge opportunity to to support farmers and the ag industry to help us in this effort. So really looking forward to discussing ways that we can really support farmers in their leadership roles and using agriculture as a natural climate solution. So thanks for the invite.
Hi, everyone. Julie McClure, and I also want to say thank you so much for allowing me the opportunity to participate in the panel. I think obviously, just in the intro, there are huge opportunities in agriculture to be meeting climate and sustainability goals. I'm a vice president with Tory Advisory Group. We are a food and ag consulting firm, and folks who don't work in the ag space think, oh, food and ag, that's a pretty small portfolio. But anyone who does work in food and ag knows this is an incredibly diverse and broad portfolio. And we keep ourselves plenty busy working with clients across that food and ag value chain. Given my background, I've really been focusing over the past several years in the ag research and innovation space. And so I think when thinking about opportunities in ag research and how we can be supporting and fostering ag research and innovation as a way to be addressing climate goals, I get really excited. And I'm lucky to work with a broad range of clients in that kind of research and innovation and sustainability space, really across the spectrum, both from more on the left-leaning side all the way and the right-leaning side, and research and innovation too is really a great issue to work on because it's pretty bipartisan and you can get a lot of buy-in from both sides of the aisles. Everyone wants to support research, support our understanding, and be able to ask better questions and then provide answers to those questions. Really thinking about too, as Andrew mentioned, what do producers, landowners, ranchers, what do they need? How can we be providing better information, better practices, better technologies and innovations to help them meet their sustainability goals, while also, being economically productive. And really, I think research is one of those places where we can be meeting both of those goals, just both increasing the ag outputs, but also meeting our sustainability and climate goals. I do think that as we're looking to the future, our food and ag system will have increasing demands on it, both with increasing population. But I think as we look to the future, and anybody who's farming right now can tell you that they are experiencing more and more challenges to the process. It's becoming more variable. It's becoming more difficult. Climate change is certainly an exacerbating factor and makes agriculture and forestry more challenging, whether it's pests and diseases, whether it's volatile weather patterns. We need to be thinking about how can we make our food and ag supply chain, and that's all the way from production to processing to getting food into grocery stores and into the hands of and into the mouths of consumers. How do we make that supply chain more resilient and more prepared for disruptions that I think both on the climate change because of climate change, we will continue to see. And so I think research plays a key piece in that. And obviously the Farm Bill, if you're working in food and ag, it's kind of like our Super Bowl. So we are looking forward to supporting policies that are going to give researchers, producers, landowners as many options and tools as possible to maintain productivity and sustainability. So thanks again, and looking forward to the discussion.
All right, I guess I'm up now, and I love this topic, and I will say so. I've always worked on climate issues from a more center-right perspective, a more free market perspective, and I see agriculture as one of these industries that really actually thrives under these conditions. If you look at agricultural productivity going back, the 1940s, it's gone up remarkably. We're about 3 times as productive now as we were, 60 to 80 years ago. We produce more food with less workers, fewer workers, less land, less capital inputs than we ever thought we could. And this is pretty significant when you think about like climate change issues, because the answer to me seems like, hey, we can really improve things a lot, really reduce our climate footprint and feed a lot more people just by looking at what the market is able to offer. And that's one of the things that, hopeful we'll be able to talk about today, kind of like, okay, what is the ag space already doing? Where's the industry moving? And what is the role of the market in getting us there? Because there's a lot of governmental solutions, and we're probably going to talk about those today with the Farm Bill, and it's always a big topic. But we also need to be cognizant that there's a big progress from the market that we don't want to stymie as well. And we see this not just in ag, but really in a lot of issues on climate change, where the market is providing solutions and already transitioning to certain behaviors, because that's what consumers want and consumers prefer very often. So that, I'm looking forward to the discussion today, and I'll let Alexandra take it away for us.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Phil. I think you started to touch on this with your remarks, but for those who are kind of new to this issue area and haven't really explored the interconnection between climate and agriculture, can you go into it? Like what is the interconnection rather?
Yeah, so the connection between climate and agriculture is really a little bit different from other sort of climate issues. So most emissions globally come from energy. So it's your car, it's your electricity. In agriculture, it comes from like the fertilizer, it comes from the land use, and it's kind of unavoidable to a certain extent. And we see that about a third of global emissions are actually from agriculture. So in the US, it's about a tenth. Andrew mentioned it's 11%, I think, at the last accounting, but it's much bigger sort of globally. And whenever people kind of talk about climate change, they're always saying like, hey, electric vehicles, or they're talking about, transitioning to renewables or something like that. And we don't see the same sort of robustness of discussion on the ag space, because a lot of people kind of have this idea that the same solutions, and really it's true, the solutions that you see bandied about for energy don't always apply to food. You can't ask people to eat less. It's not always practical to ask people to change their diets. There's a big push for like plant-based diets, but that also entails trade-offs, especially in developing nations where animal protein is very valuable. So there are these questions that are kind of unanswered, and it doesn't lend itself to the same sort of central planning solution mindsets that you see talked about in the political space. But what makes this really interesting is we do see a lot of market potential, because things are getting more efficient. And there's kind of a question of like, okay, well, if we're producing more food using less land, are we also improving our carbon intensity? And we do see that. US food products are actually usually less emission intensive than foreign competitors, especially when you think about like beef, which is really emission intensive. It's a lot less emission intensive in the United States than it is in Brazil, which is one of the largest cattle meat suppliers in the world. So when we think about this problem specifically, it's kind of like, okay, how do we produce the same amount of food or more food with fewer resources and lower emissions? And that creates a very interesting puzzle. And I'll let Julie and Andrew chime in, because they're also they're really gifted experts in this field, and I'd love to hear their thoughts as well.
I guess I'll say another area that's interesting about agriculture and its connection with climate is I think there are opportunities for agriculture to be a climate solution. There are climate solutions involved in agriculture. And one of those is really, and I'm sure we'll go into this a lot more, but just thinking about a lot of agriculture is done in the soil, and soil has the capability to be sequestering carbon. It can, soil can actually, you can bring down your emissions when you sequester carbon, carbon in the soil. And so we actually have a long history of understanding certain practices that help that, which not only sequestering more carbon in your soil not only can often increase yield, it can increase resiliency. It can help resiliency towards extreme weather events, so too much water or not quite enough water. But then it also can, provide a climate benefit too. So it is one of those opportunities where there can be really that win-win-win, where you can be meeting climate goals and increasing sustainability while also many times increasing your productivity. And And I think while there's a host of practices that we do know help sequester soil and increase, maybe soil health is a term folks have heard about before, but there are a lot of new innovative, whether they're practices or products or techniques that we can be thinking about that I think can just really increase that benefit, thinking about, and then I think we can also talk a little bit about, other greenhouse gas emissions, thinking about nitrous oxide, thinking about enteric methane. There are many kind of levers within the ag system that are ripe for increased efficiencies that can really help meet our sustainability goals.
Yeah, I would say totally agree with Julie there. And Philip, as you were talking, I was thinking a little bit more about sort of like the nature of these production systems. So, agriculture is a very unique production system, unlike, maybe transportation or energy, which are mechanical production systems. Agriculture is alive. It's a living production system, and as a result has infinite variability within its production system. So it's a lot more difficult to maybe have control over every aspect of your production system. And so there's still so much we need to know about the production systems and how to just even measure a lot of emissions. I mean, a lot of that work is being done right now in the private sector and in sort of civil society, but there's so much more we need to learn. And so that's why things like research are really important to help farmers and researchers better understand which practices are going to work the best and where, to help mitigate emissions from production systems in agriculture. There's huge opportunities to create new innovations, new tools, and sort of the next generation of technologies that will help farmers address emissions from agriculture and help them build resilience on their own farms. As we've all mentioned, it gets harder for them to farm in a changing climate and with more extreme weather variations and things like that. New technologies are coming to market all the time, and Congress, has really been really active in this space. We saw, last summer, the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act directed a lot of money towards conservation programs at USDA that will help reduce risk for farmers for taking on some of these practices and help provide technical and financial assistance to farmers who really are looking to access a lot of these programs. A lot of these conservation programs at USDA are way oversubscribed and underfunded. They only fund about 1 in 3 applications. So we know that there's overwhelming demand from farmers to access a lot of these programs. And the Inflation Reduction Act had specific language in there prioritizing practices and new tools that can actually address emissions from agriculture. And so that's new policy. And so we were really excited to see Congress pass that legislation last year, and really hoping that we can build on those investments in this upcoming farm bill here.
Yeah, that's great. And Andrew, I know you just mentioned the IRA farm bill opportunities. I'd really like to, if you guys can, paint a picture for viewers so that they can get an idea of just how much climate benefit is out there to be captured by U.S. ag and forestry sectors. Open-ended for everyone.
Yeah, well, I'm actually going to lead on Andrew's colleagues and their research, but EDF, they've done some research, and also the Breakthrough Institute, which is a fantastic agriculture and focus institute as well. They have shown that you could probably get around 500 million metric tons of climate abatement, like emission abatement and CO2 equivalent, from the ag and forestry sectors, just from a lot of practices of changing innovation and the way agriculture is performed, like dietary changes to cattle, to agroforestry things where they plant like trees in between the rows of crops, things like precision agriculture, where you can use artificial intelligence to determine where is the most efficient place to use fertilizer, so you cut down your fertilizer consumption, which is a big source of emissions. These, together, kind of all combined, there are all these small things, but there are just so many of them out there. They're just waiting in the wings that they add up to a lot. And there are some people even say, hey, when you start to look at all these potentials, you might even have the possibility of a carbon sink. Julie mentioned soil sequestration, which is still something we're doing a lot of research about. But that's something where people are saying, hey, that could really hold a lot of potential for emission abatement.
Yeah, I'd also say that livestock is the sort of second largest source of methane emissions next to oil and gas, and there's some new technologies coming out right now, some things like feed additives like seaweed and other other compounds that are coming out that we can add to maybe considerably reduce a lot of enteric methane from livestock. New manure management practices and things like digesters and new technologies to address manure management practices that can also reduce methane from agriculture are coming to market. And again, in the Inflation Reduction Act, directed a lot of investment towards those types of technologies too. New research again that's coming out. We can really make huge progress on methane reductions with a lot of the new investments that have been coming out of Congress and from the administration as well. And that to me, I see as a huge opportunity there to really incentivize and create some new incentives for producers to adopt new practices, new technologies, and really deploy the tools that are needed to draw down emissions and help a lot of these industries meet their climate commitments, which they've made. And so we also see a lot in the private sector. There's a lot of private sector investment going into methane reduction strategies. A lot of companies that have dairy or beef in their supply chains are really have started to make climate commitments and are directing a lot of investments into finding ways to achieve those goals. And so there's just a ton of interest here, and I think there, particularly in the methane and even in the nitrous oxide, there's a lot of opportunity to address pretty significant sources, while also not only empowering farmers to take a leadership role in this, but also to really help them remain profitable and to boost their, open up additional revenue streams for them as they take on new practices. And that's really been a huge development over even just the past 18 months, I'd say.
Great. That's actually a good segue into my next question. I think when we discuss climate policy, innovation is obviously front and center oftentimes in these discussions. So I'd love for you all to discuss the innovation aspect for this sector and, obviously how that would improve emissions. And I do want to return to Julie's point about soil sequestration. I think it would be great to kind of hear a little bit more, hear you dive into the opportunities and perhaps some limitations that exist with those practices as well.
I'm happy to speak to that. I think innovation is kind of the key to everything. So certainly meeting our agriculture production goals, and in addition to our climate goals, I really think innovation is going to be key. Research and innovation, understanding those questions and then answering them in a way that's going to give producers and landowners more tools and more options is definitely the way to go. I always like to talk about that supporting especially the research title of the Farm Bill. I think a strong research title supports and underpins every other title of the Farm Bill. If you're thinking about energy or rural communities or nutrition or risk mitigation, if we have a really strong research title of the Farm Bill, then I think that benefits all the other titles. And so opportunities for innovation, for new tools. And also I think understanding the tools and the practices that we currently have, understanding what are the best ways to utilize those practices under different systems in different geographies. How do we get those tools and the things that we know right now? When I talk to a lot of scientists, I think there's there's 400 more questions that we have to answer before we can act. And I really think that there's a lot that we know right now, whether it's, cover cropping and we have practices right now that we know work. We have to think about how we can deploy them in different systems, how we can help people that manage that transition from maybe an old system to new practices, and how do we assist producers with that? How do we make sure that it's going to be tailored to their system, to their region, to their location? Andrew talked about technical assistance. That's something that we need to make sure, like, farmers, I think, are becoming, especially younger farmers, are becoming more and more interested in either practices that we know have climate benefits and production benefits, but then also what are those new practices that are coming down the pike, whether it's, you know, innovative feed additives, whether it's precision agriculture, whether it's new fertilizer products or technologies that are going to, you know, keep the fertilizer on the soil, whether it's water irrigation technologies. You know, there are a lot of opportunities to be innovating and bringing those to a lot of different kinds of production systems. As far as soil carbon sequestration, you know, I do think there's a lot of potential in this space, but as I mentioned, I guess I'll digress with a tiny anecdote. I worked on, you know, cancer research when I was in grad school, and it was interesting because the research that you did in New England versus Florida versus California, you could do the same kind of research, and that's not how ag research works. The agricultural systems and products in the Northeast and in the South and in you know, in the West or in the breadbasket, they're all really different, and we need to be understanding of that diversity. Now that creates huge opportunity, but it also creates some challenges where I don't think we're at the place where we can just say, this is the practice that all producers under any system, under any, you know, regional variability, cropping variability can utilize, and that will be the silver bullet for them. So we do have to be thoughtful about the variability in our food and ag systems. And I think soil carbon sequestration is one of those key places. You know, obviously soil types are going to be incredibly different across the country, and even within regions, even within you know, farms that have large footprints, you can have a really different soil types even across a single production system. So one of the key I guess gaps in our understanding about really utilizing the full potential of soil carbon sequestration is I think in the MMRV, so the monitoring, measuring, reporting and verification of soil carbon. Given the diversity of soil types, and right now, you know, when we want to measure soil carbon, if you talk to a soil scientist that I talk to all the time, this is a manual procedure where you're taking a soil sample from the ground and then you bring that into a lab and you do an analysis on it. That is an incredibly labor intensive, it's costly, it's time intensive, and it doesn't even give you the diversity across a single field of understanding where your soil carbon could be. So this is an area where I think we are absolutely, you know, primed for innovation and a disruptive, whether it's a technology or a new system, to be able to in real time and to be able to monitor and understand what is happening with a production system or a field soil carbon. That really seems to be where that's kind of the dream goal to get to, where you could be checking your soil carbon on your app, like you can check your bank account. But, you know, we're still a bit of a ways off from there. But I think there are opportunities, but we want to make sure that, you know, and I think we're going to talk more about carbon markets too. Any markets that are going to be built around this opportunity is going to really need to be based in strong science, in strong data, in strong understanding. There are still questions that we need to have answered, and I think that's going to take more research, and it's going to take thoughtful policy development, understanding that this is still a relatively new field, and we want to make sure that we are putting in place policies that can both allow this new market to kind of foster, but also have it be built on really strong foundational understanding. We want it to be based on good data, on good measurements, so that it's providing good value to producers, it's providing good value to the entities that are participating in those markets, and of course, it's meeting our climate and emissions reductions goals.
Yeah, so one thing I'll add on the innovation is one thing that's kind of interesting about agriculture innovation compared to like conventional climate innovation stuff is whenever people talk about climate innovation, they're usually talking about things that are really capital intensive to demonstrate and require like, national labs. They're talking about like new types of nuclear reactors and, new power plant designs and like these big offshore projects. And the agriculture space, a lot of the innovation is, much kind of smaller scale that can be very impactful because there are just so many different parts of this industry that can be affected. So, like one thing that people try to do is try to find out like what kind of music makes cows produce more milk and stuff like that. And that's not like a high cost innovation, but that is something that affects productivity. In the climate space, though, we do still have some pretty impactful and I think large scale projects try to affect this. We have there's this thing called ARPA-E, which does like climate research and development, and they have something called the Roots Project, where they try to develop new seed types, new seed types for crops that can essentially have larger root structures, which allows them to sequester more soil and carbon, improve soil health, and then there are all these other things. So Andrew mentioned the seaweed. This is something that's like pretty new. People hadn't really thought about seaweed as a cattle feed additive, but people are like, oh, actually, that could affect their sort of enteric fermentation. And now they're finding out, oh, that could cut enteric fermentation, cow farts by like over 80% with a very small amount in the diet. And they polled people like, can you tell the difference in the taste of the milk and the meat? And no, they couldn't, because like a tiny amount. So there are all these sort of like small and relatively low cost innovation opportunities out there, but there just hasn't been a big impetus for it. There's no market benefit to having a cow that has lower enteric fermentation outside of the consumer demand and the climate benefit, which is an externality. So it's those sort of pressures that are starting to bubble up in the market and also from the public space that are starting to gear this innovation into this direction, and that's largely a good thing, I would say.
Yeah, and on that, Philip, I totally agree. I think that's where potentially USDA through some of their cost share and conservation programs could play a role until the market really kind of matures around some of those new technologies and really starts sending those demand signals so that the free market can take over and do what it does best. But in the meantime, I think the support that we've seen from Congress and through the Inflation Reduction Act and from the administration through some of their programs like the Partnership for Climate Smart Commodities, that's really kind of filling the gap right now until the market can really kind of take it and run with some of these technologies. So been really encouraged to see some of that, but I'm also really encouraged for what's going to happen in the future once the market's able to figure these things out and make it worthwhile for farmers.
And if I could just kind of pull off of one thing that Philip mentioned, talking about ARPA-E, it's a great model. These advanced research programs, we've seen them at DARPA for defense, energy, and ARPA-E. There's just created an ARPA-H for health. Well, not everybody realizes, but USDA has it's a pilot program, but it's an ARPA itself. It's called Ag-ARDA. And that was actually created in the 2018 Farm Bill as to be an advanced research agency within USDA, specifically tackling those really wicked challenges within ag, which we know there's no shortage of big challenges in ag. And so that's another opportunity, specifically in the Farm Bill, to be supporting research and innovation. You have kind of your more, it's called foundational or discovery research that USDA is really good at doing and supporting. But I think there's also opportunities to be supporting these transformational high risk, high reward research projects, which something like an Ag-ARDA or an ARPA style research program is really well positioned to do.
So, Philip, I know you wrote a paper recently that goes into more detail about this, but can you discuss the market opportunities that exist to, capture these emission benefits? It's already been kind of alluded to earlier.
Yeah, well, Andrew kind of touched upon this, how there's not really like a big private sector uptake of these sort of changes in the ag space right now. But we have seen a lot of movement in the private sector taking actions where, not exclusive to agriculture, but saying, hey, we want to encourage climate action beyond sort of our own activities. So what that often looks like is like an airline. So if you buy a plane ticket now, you'll often have an option like, oh, do you want to go green? And what the airline will do is they'll take that money and they'll buy a carbon offset somewhere where they're basically paying someone to change their behavior to avoid a pollutant. And from an economics perspective, this is great because you have, the people have the capital and the desire to make the change, giving the money to make that behavioral change to someone who otherwise has no incentive to do it. The problem we've seen so far is before I even get to the problems, I should say that this actually has a huge amount of potential. Like, the scale of carbon offsets and carbon sequestration that could be in markets is, significant enough that it could be a solution for like a lot of industries. But what's holding us back in a lot of ways is that there's not really a lot of confidence in a lot of the carbon credits out there. And a lot of it is because of their sources. So we see like 38% of carbon credits that you can buy are from renewable energy. But a lot of renewable energy is already cheaper than fossil fuel. So, if you're going to build renewable energy anyway, and then you're paying someone to build renewable energy for a carbon credit, you're not actually getting a new climate benefit. You actually have to change the behavior to get there. And then we start to bring in the ag space. What we see is, hey, there's actually a lot of opportunity for emission abatement in the agriculture sector, but the farmers are just not getting offered enough money to make it worthwhile. They're getting offered like $9 per acre for practices, but it's really like, $60 per acre that they say that they need. And then we start to look at, okay, what's holding us back? You see this kind of sense of, hey, if there's a lot of fraud in the carbon markets right now, if we have a lot of low quality offsets where we can't really verify their additionality, which is like the additional climate benefit, even some of the really well-respected verifiers in the markets have gotten flack for like huge amounts of rainforest credits that they said were additional. It's like, no, actually these aren't really resulting in any new climate benefit. So correcting that market failure, saying, hey, stop giving the money to projects that aren't giving any new climate benefit, that could cause the supply to shrink, which would increase the demand for them relative to the supply, increases their price. And then we might see the prices start to reach a point where the farmers are saying, hey, we're going to change our behavior because we actually see this market opportunity now. So kind of from my perspective, I think carbon markets have a lot of opportunity for refinement and have a lot of potential. And this is one of those areas where I see a lot of potential in saying, hey, if you are good at cracking down on fraud in the market, then you're going to get more genuine opportunities. And that's going to be good for US farmers.
Awesome. Yeah. And that was going to kind of be my next question. Obviously they have potential, but they're also controversial. So, I'd love to hear, if you can dive into like, how do we fix these issues that exist within carbon markets?
Yeah. Well, before I hand it off to Andrew and Julie, I'll just say that I think a big part of it is taking the programs that we already have and using those in a way that helps to legitimize these practices and give more certainty. Julie mentioned like, hey, if you're doing this, you need to have confidence in that. And I think that's kind of one of the things that's holding back a lot of investment in these activities is people are just not sure if they're going to get that benefit, because you see a lot of stories about companies in the news where it's like, oh yeah, they claim they're carbon neutral and turns out they weren't. So improving that confidence through the existing programs that are aimed at climate and agricultural EQIP and the stuff that was in the 2018 Farm Bill, that goes a long way. But also there are these international programs that the United States participates in, like CORSIA, which is this international aviation offsetting scheme. Lobbying that to say, hey, we need to have a higher standard of participation for the carbon credits in a way that shows that the U.S. ag opportunities are going to be recognized and fewer of the potentially fraudulent opportunities are. And also, understand that there are other countries that are moving forward with policies that could in the future go in that direction. Europe is adopting a border adjusting mechanism for carbon. That doesn't affect food yet, but if it ever did, that's something where it's kind of like, hey, we need better sort of metrics and accounting and understanding of our climate footprint for our food and how we can reduce it.
Yeah, I might just jump in here. There are efforts, sort of independent efforts to maintain integrity in these voluntary carbon markets. The Integrity Council for the voluntary carbon market is one that we work with pretty closely and provide feedback to when they are sort of, they don't set the rules, but they provide guidance on how we can maintain the integrity of these voluntary carbon markets. I think in agriculture, soil carbon has really kind of been the big shiny object and the kind of in the eye of a lot of folks who are interested in the sector. But I sort of mentioned before, but I think there's some real opportunities to reduce absolute emissions from from methane and from nitrous oxide that are maybe a little bit more easy to measure. I mean, it's not perfect yet, and we're still getting there, and more research needs to be done in order to set some baselines. But those are real reductions. If you stop it before it's even released into the atmosphere, that is a real reduction, and reduce, particularly with methane. If you can stop it before it even gets into the air, I mean, you're really saving yourself from warming potential later on. And so those are the things that I'm hoping. USDA only spends about 2% of their research dollars on enteric methane or methane from agriculture in general, on studying methane emissions. But it accounts for about 41% of all agricultural emissions overall. And so I think there's a massive opportunity to really kind of maybe flip the narrative here. And maybe, I mean, soil carbon is really important. I think that we need to do a lot more research to understand that and the emissions and their reductions from soil carbon. But I think there's other areas where we could be putting a little bit more focus on better understanding how we can make real impacts with even more concentrated greenhouse gases. And so that's where I would encourage some researchers and USDA to spend a little bit more time focusing on maybe those other areas outside of soil carbon.
And I'm not an animal scientist, but the half-life of methane is much shorter. That's what's something that's so interesting about methane, is that there are some short, in 12 years, we could be addressing this, which is that is the sort of time frame that we need to be working on for some of to address some of these challenges. So I do think there's incredible opportunity in the methane space and in nitrous oxide. I mean, you have really interesting, when I think about precision agriculture and how we can be applying fertilizers in a so much more precise and tailored way to even a single field, it's really exciting. And that is an opportunity to also be saving producers money. For such a long time, fertilizer was really cheap and it was really available. And it was an insurance policy that I think a lot of, not in a necessarily, malicious way, but producers said, I'm going to throw a little extra on and see if I can't get that little bit of yield bump. And I think the current, the global geopolitical challenges that we've been dealing with on the fertilizer availability over the past few years has given folks an opportunity to be thinking about how can I be more judicious and precise with fertilizer application. And so obviously you have the emissions reduction, you have their significant water quality benefits that you're looking at. So I completely agree. Lots of opportunity in soil carbon. We want to build strong, robust markets that are based on good data, good understanding of what's there. But I totally agree that we need to be looking at some of these other greenhouse gases and how we can be, what were the other opportunities in those spaces.
Yeah, and just maybe a plug. There is a bill in Congress called the Precision Agriculture Loan Act, led by Senator Fisher, which would provide sort of smaller loans to smaller and medium-sized producers who generally are priced out of a lot of this new technology. And so that's a real concern within the ag sector is, how do we, spread adoption of a lot of these new technologies and create access and inclusion for not just, the sort of biggest producers, but also the family farms and other underserved farmers potentially who don't have the same level of access as maybe some of their larger counterparts. So just want to mention that I think the opportunities for precision agriculture are enormous. We had a report recently really discussing some of the potential of these precision agriculture technologies. And so I'm really excited to see, I think this farm bill is going to be really interesting in its focus on expanding opportunities for innovators to really get into the ag sector. I think we've seen a lot of new like venture capital funding and other private sector efforts to really bring some technology to what is kind of the most ancient of industries is agriculture. So it's really exciting to see it. I'm glad that Congress is paying attention and reacting accordingly.
Great. And then this is just a quick reminder to viewers that you can drop any questions you have in the chat and we'll try to get to them in our remaining time. So we've covered a ton so far, but I am curious, what does all that we've talked about, what does it all mean for agriculture in terms of food security? I'd love to hear from Julie, and then Phil, sort of related, if you can provide a, aspect to the, agricultural trade as well. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, so when you think about our agriculture and our domestic agriculture supply, as it relates to our competitiveness, I think there's a very clear connection. We are lucky enough to have one of the most abundant, most affordable, safest food supplies in the entire world. I think a lot of that is based off of decades of investments in research and in our food and ag system to make it the most, like I said, the most productive, the safest, the most affordable that it could possibly be. But when I think about today and think about maybe the next, several decades, if you look at our agricultural research investments over the past 20 years, if you kind of estimate for kind of inflation and real dollar amounts, our public investment in ag R&D is back where it was in 2002. So it's fallen by about a third. And then I look at other countries, and if anyone was on the House Ag research hearing just before this stat came up multiple times. So I'm probably telling you something you already know, but many other countries are putting significant investments in in public ag R&D. China, Brazil, India. China now outspends us 2-1. And so when I think about whatever that next innovation in food and ag is going to be, I want it to be created here domestically. I want it to be established here in the United States and benefit our farmers. But I think there's, a benefit to that is really going to be a key to maintaining our leadership, maintaining our competitiveness. And I think we need to be thinking about as our systems become more vulnerable to climate change, how are we preparing? How are we investing today for those challenges 5, 10, 20 years out? Yeah, and I think no matter how expensive it is, this farm bill, I think it'll be more expensive than the next farm bill, and even more expensive if we kind of wait to put some of these policies in place. It's just going to continue to be more expensive. And so I think really trying to be forward thinking and looking to the future for those investments. I want to have in 5 years, I want to have the investments made now that are going to benefit us in the future.
And, I know we're running out of time, so I'll try to cover my portion of that really quickly. But something to keep in mind is that U.S. sort of competitiveness of our products, the more productive we are, the better it is globally, because people are really looking at costs when they're looking at products. So if we're able to produce a lot of food cheaply, and we're also having a climate benefit with that, that helps both the climate, but also helps us economically because we're going to be a supplier. We're going to be able to essentially outcompete competitors. One sort of risk that we run into when we look at trying to micromanage, how we address every sort of market issue or climate issue is we can inadvertently sort of create these structures where we're steering away from the things that we're actually good at. So I think one of those things is, not to knock on plant-based diets or whatever, but there's a lot of focus on we got to move away from cattle meat. We got to move away from cattle meat. But we also produce a lot of chicken, which is not very emission intensive. And that actually is maybe these sort of things present other sort of interim solutions and also create opportunities economically for export and saying, hey, if we improve these productivity aspects, we're going to kind of hit both nails on the head. Andrew, I don't know if you have anything you want to add on that. So.
No, not on that. I do want to leave room for questions because I see we're getting some good ones. So maybe
Yeah.
Alex, I'll leave it to you.
Yeah. So let's definitely transition to audience Q&A. So I'll start with this one. Farmers sometimes complain that environmental regulations from the states or federal government do not match scientific reality or the realities of their jobs right now, even if they agree with those goals. How should regulators balance what they can do right now with long-term clean energy and environmental goals?
Yeah, I think particularly in this space, because there's a lot of unknowns that I mentioned earlier, there's sort of infinite variability in agriculture. And so that's a constant point of contention, I think, between regulators and the ag sector. There are some hopeful stories too. Right now, actually, in the US Senate, there is a bill that was introduced last week to cut regulations at FDA to allow a more streamlined regulatory pathway for some of the feed additives that we'd mentioned before that can help actually reduce enteric methane emissions from livestock. And so that bill is actually being considered as an amendment as part of the Animal Drug User Fee Act markup, which will happen tomorrow, I believe. And right now, these feed additives are sort of inappropriately regulated as drugs, which is a far lengthier, more costly pathway to approval, regulatory pathway. And so, bills like this, which has bipartisan support, would actually streamline and cut red tape at FDA to allow these products to come to market more quickly, so that it can help the livestock industry and other industries innovate and bring these new products to market that can actually help us all achieve our 2030 and 2050 climate goals. And so really encouraged to see some broad bipartisan agreement on the need to really make regulations, environmental regulations and health and safety regulations really make sense and allow for innovation as well. So that's one anecdote I will flag for where Congress is really kind of doing a great job of conducting its oversight over some of these regulatory agencies.
As I guess one thing I'll just add real quick is regulators are always going to be kind of like rigid, and I mean that's kind of their role. And what we see that's interesting is when there's more flexibility in the way regulations are carried out, you tend to get better outcomes, especially for climate. And one kind of novel thing was up until like the 2018 Farm Bill, cover crops were not covered under crop insurance. So this is kind of this perversion of like the federal government saying, okay, we're going to essentially take over this role that normally would be in the private sector for whatever reasons. But because the government is essentially the purveyor of crop insurance, that sort of oversight of politicians meant that farmers are actually not really engaging in sort of the best practices. So when they change that, things have improved, and that's good for climate, good for soil health. But acknowledging that, okay, more flexibility and sort of less stringency in the regulation creates opportunities for farmers to be more innovative in their productivity, that can be very beneficial.
Awesome. And I'm going to jump into our next question. What are a few policy recommendations with ag research in relation to the Farm Bill? Universities are already tax exempt to perform farm research. There are a lot of state ag venture funds. There's profit to be made from tech adoption. What more can be done aside from stopping manipulation of farmers into growing problematic crops such as ethanol?
So I'll say that I think one, thinking about where could new innovations be coming down the pike and trying to create policies that would allow for flexibility, allow for new innovations, don't box people in, is really important. We see that in the conservation title. I think there could be greater emphasis on some of these, on something like nitrous oxide, emissions reductions. So expanding those, the kind of the options of farmers in the research space and what they can be experimenting with, and making sure that our policies aren't inflexible to new innovation is going to be really important. I think ways that we can foster, I think they talk about state ag ventures, but how to foster public-private partnerships, how to better leverage the investments that are made publicly and connecting them to private dollars. There's this this term called the Valley of Death, where it's beyond kind of discovery research that a lot of is publicly funded to where you can actually implement and make a product and bring something to market. That intermediate space is an opportunity where I think we can create those bridges and create those partnerships in order to facilitate development and more innovation there. And I would say, once again, just kind of being forward thinking and making sure that there are options, and that, you know, when I think about something like plant biostimulants, like that wasn't even really a category of products at the last Farm Bill, but now there are many options in that space. And so trying to be as flexible with our policies as possible to allow for innovation in the time frame of that 5-year Farm Bill timeframe.
Yeah, and you know, I think it's just kind of an interesting point how sometimes the like well-intended policies can be like very invasive, and you know, like ethanol crops and such. But I think that also creates a point that we want to sort of avoid the temptation to just say, oh yeah, this works, let's just fund it more, make it bigger. You know, we do kind of reach these points where some programs can reach their optimal level, but it also speaks to, hey, you know, more competitive programs that create more opportunities for farmers to voluntarily engage in practices can potentially get you more benefit and more sort of interest, rather than just saying like, okay, you know, you must do this or you must do that.
And I would also say that, you know, you've heard the old adage, you know, a penny of prevention is worth a pound of whatever, you know, reaction or something. I forget what. Julie, help me out here.
Cure, a pound
Cure.
of cure.
Right. Yeah. A penny of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And so actually a lot of these research programs more than pay for themselves many times over. You know, public research has been shown to generate far more economic benefit than it costs. And so, you know, there's real value here in some of the public research programs through USDA. And so I would say that, you know, like if you just look at the numbers without the actual benefit of what you're getting, you know, I think that's that can be a little bit misleading. But you know, the investments that we're making here through some of these USDA research programs far outweigh the costs of those dollars, and a little can go really a long way when we're talking about innovation. Also, just, you know, it's the nature of the agriculture production system and supply chain is such that you know, finding those private sector innovators can sometimes be a little bit more challenging than maybe in other sectors. There's not necessarily the direct tie, and that's a whole historical maybe backstory there that I won't go into here today, but there's it's a different industry than I think most other sectors, and so having a good understanding of the levers for change within agriculture is necessary to create good policy.
Awesome. Unfortunately, we're out of time. So I think that was a great note to close on, Andrew. I wanted to thank our panelists again for a great discussion. I know I learned a lot, and I hope you all found their insights to be valuable. And we look forward to future opportunities to engage on this important topic. Thank you, everyone.